Hey, thanks for clicking on this video. What I'm going to do here is go over the two main sensory pathways. We're going to cover the spinothalamic pathway as well as the posterior or dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Real quick, don't forget to hit subscribe, turn on notifications so you get a notification every time I submit a new video. I'm going to use the iPad here with this drawing to draw out these pathways, and hopefully it'll answer any questions you might have about this topic. So going to draw out first here of our sensory pathways, let's go through the posterior or dorsal column pathway, which is also known as the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, and you'll see why as I draw it out. I'm going to draw the neurons in blue. Now, something that's important to realize when we're talking about the sensory pathways as opposed to the motor pathway, the corticospinal tract, which see my other video if you haven't already, is that the sensory pathways have three neurons. Corticospinal tract has two, and our spinothalamic and dorsal column pathways have three neurons in length. And we call these the first order, second order, or third order neurons as they are ascending. So these are afferent neurons, right? Traveling up into the brain, afferent, as opposed to the motor neurons being efferent, traveling down. So let me go ahead and draw our first order neuron that would be coming in here through the spinal nerve root and coming in through the posterior root at this spinal cord segment. And as you can see with this drawing, we're using a lumbar level from the spinal cord. Now, really important to know is right here is our cell body for our first order neuron in this dorsal column pathway, which resides there in the dorsal root ganglion. So that's the first order neuron. Now with this first dorsal column pathway, the first order neuron, as it enters into the spinal cord at this level, it will not decussate and will immediately start heading up within the spinal cord at this point without synapsing on a second order neuron. Okay, and it's going to travel up the ipsilateral side of the spinal cord, so the same side of the spinal cord from which it originated, or which it entered rather. It'll stay on that same side, but in the what we call the posterior columns or the dorsal column, which is this little segment of the spinal cord back here. It will stay in that region of white matter, which are also known as the gracile and cuneate fasciculi, as it ascends there in the spinal cord. So it's going to travel up here, up from the lumbar region. Oh, it's not a very straight line. Let me try again. And it's going to come up here, same side as on the spinal cord, until it gets to the lower medulla. Okay, the lower medulla right there above the foramen magnum. And at that level, it's going to synapse on a second order neuron, the cell body of a second order neuron. Now these cell bodies reside within two different nuclei or collection of cell bodies called the gracile and cuneate nuclei. They're within the medulla, the lower medulla. Now immediately upon that synapse, the second order neuron is going to cross midline and then ascend. And when it crosses midline and starts to ascend, we call that pathway in which it's ascending the medial lemniscus pathway. And that's why I guess the full formal name of this pathway is the posterior column medial lemniscus pathway. It was within the posterior dorsal column within the spinal cord, but once we're in the medulla and that second order neuron has decussated and started its ascent, it's traveling within the medial lemniscus pathway. And so it's going to ascend up through that contralateral side from which it entered, and once it reaches the level of the thalamus, it's going to synapse on a third order sensory neuron in the thalamus. And from there, that third order neuron is going to travel through that internal capsule. And if we're heading over to the sensory strip of the leg, in the anterior parietal lobe, it's going to travel there into the more medial aspect of that cortical strip. So that's our first order. Right? This is our first order neuron. Our second order neuron is the one from that travels within that medial lemniscus after it decussates. okay, in the lower medulla, and then it will ascend up to the thalamus, and then here we have our third order neuron. Now, this posterior or dorsal column pathway carries very important sensory information from the peripheral tissue. Specifically, it's carrying information about proprioception, so where the body is in space, where the tissues are in space, in the extremities. So proprioception, vibration, and very, very fine touch. Okay, so fine touch, vibration, proprioception information is coming in this way. So let me go ahead and change colors. And we're going to go ahead and draw now the spinothalamic pathway going from spine to thalamus. So this is our other main sensory pathway. Now, first order neuron for this pathway is also coming in through this dorsal root, through the dorsal pathway. So coming in the spinal nerve, coming in through the dorsal root into the back side of the spinal cord at that level. Importantly, its cell body also resides within that dorsal root ganglion. And so this would be also a first order neuron, okay, first order sensory neuron. And one of the biggest differences here with this neuron or this pathway, spinothalamic, is that this first order neuron, when it enters, it's going to synapse almost immediately in that same spinal cord level on a second order neuron that resides there in the posterior horn of the gray matter. Okay, so we're already synapsing on our second order neuron. That second order neuron at that same spinal level is going to immediately decussate through this little white matter pathway right there, which happens to be called, this little white area here is the anterior white commissure. And notice it's anterior to the gray matter at that level. So that second order neuron immediately crosses midline, it immediately decussates, and then it will ascend here within kind of an anterior white matter track right in front of that anterior horn of the white matter called the spinothalamic tract. Okay, so it will ascend in that part of the spinal cord and the white matter on the contralateral side from which that pathway entered. And so it's going to be traveling up the spinal cord on this side. Okay, and notice it's already decussated. It's not going to synapse again until it actually gets to the thalamus. Spinothalamic pathway. So when it reaches this thalamus, it's going to synapse on the third order neuron there, which is going to then project its sensory information up into the sensory cortex. So again, we've got our third neuron and our second neuron. So notice some of the biggest differences that you want to pay attention to here are that the third order neuron for both pathways go from thalamus to the sensory cortex. The first order neuron for both of these sensory pathways enter in through that dorsal root into the spinal cord, and cell bodies reside within the dorsal root ganglion. But the biggest key difference is what happens immediately upon entry into the spinal cord at that level. The posterior medial lemniscus pathway is going to immediately ascend on that same side of the spinal cord, just within the white matter tracts there on the back of the spinal cord, the posterior columns. And it will not decussate until it's synapsed on the second order neuron. The spinothalamic pathway, on the other hand, that first order neuron synapses on the second order neuron immediately in that spinal cord segment, and the second order neuron immediately decussates over to the other side. So maybe you can make the connection here that the second order neuron for both pathways is the one that decussates, and it decussates immediately once it's synapsed, right? Once the axon leaves the cell body, it's crossing midline and then ascending. Okay, so both pathways, second order neuron is the one that decussates, and it decussates at the level upon which it was synapsed. So for the posterior column pathway, decussation is happening in the lower medulla. For the spinothalamic pathway, decussation is happening at that spinal level where the second order neuron originated. Okay. So the spinothalamic pathway then is carrying important information about more crude touch and, importantly, pain information, so pain fibers, and temperature, so crude touch, pain, and temperature on spinothalamic, where with the posterior dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway, we're carrying more light touch as well as vibration and proprioception information. Okay, so using this information, drawing these things out, practicing this way, and practicing it along with drawing out the motor pathway can really help you gain an understanding of the anatomy of these motor and sensory pathways, which is going to help you be better at localizing lesions based on clinical presentation, based on deficits that are noted, focal neurologic deficits. All right, I hope you found this video helpful and that it's going to help you master this content. If you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I'd be happy to try to answer those, and feel free to share with any of your friends. Don't forget to hit subscribe. Give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Thank you.